Welcome to GDP. We bring you the reality we think you need to know, unfiltered, unpolished.
Welcome back to the Grok Daily Podcast, your go-to source for insights into the latest in business policy and law. I'm your host, Steve Hesselton, and today we have a special episode lined up as we delve into the intricacies of labor, employment, and workplace safety in the context of a new political landscape. So joining me today is Craig Leen, a well-known name in the realms of labor law. So Craig, just so you know, served as the director of OFCCP, which is the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, under President Trump's first term. And now he's a partner at K&L Gates, specializing in labor, employment, and workplace safety, as well as public policy and law practices. Great conversation. We delve into, as President Trump begins his second term, we're going to need to unpack how employers can navigate the shifting sands of policy, compliance, and legal expectations. So we'll explore the implications of new appointees, fresh executive orders, and how these could affect everything from DE&I initiatives to overtime regulations. Plus, we'll touch on critical issues like employee free speech and how political activity in the workplace might be influenced. So stay tuned for an insightful discussion with one of the sharpest minds in employment law. So we are with Craig Leen. I'll go ahead and let Craig go ahead and introduce himself.
My name is Craig Leen. I am a partner at K&L Gates in Washington, D.C. I'm the pro bono coordinator for our D.C. office. I'm the head of our OFCCP and affirmative action compliance area for the firm. I'm also the co-chair of our disability inclusion task force for the firm. And before I was at K&L Gates, I was the director of OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs of the U.S. Department of Labor during President Trump's first term. And I also teach. I've taught for many years. I currently teach at George Washington University Law School. I teach disability rights law. I teach local government law. I teach government lawyering. Those are the current courses I'm doing. They change each semester, but those are the three main courses I'm doing now. And then I serve on a lot of different boards and committees. I'm the vice chair of the DC Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and I'm the co-chair of the DC Family Support Council, which works with the Division for Disability Services for Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Well, I do appreciate your time. And if you want, perhaps just kind of give us an overview of some of the changes that are coming down the pike and give our listeners sort of an overview of the most significant executive orders affecting, not just the DE&I, but the labor laws under the new Trump administration.
Sure. So I'd say that, we're still seeing a lot of executive orders issued every day. So right now, the most prominent executive order, the one that I would focus on the most if I were an employer, are the two DEI executive orders that happened towards the beginning of the administration on January 20th and 21st. One of the executive orders was focused more on the federal workforce, basically eliminating DEI programs in the federal workforce. Although that doesn't directly apply to employers, because it applies to the public sector and specifically the federal government, it still gives you a sign of what the White House wants employers to do and what they are doing in the federal workforce. And there's been some implementation of that, including the Office of Personnel Management has issued a memo explaining how that will be enforced. So I think that that's very helpful from a guidance perspective to employers as to what is the White House looking for here. And then the second executive order, which is really the most prominent one for federal contractors and for employers generally, is the one on that was issued on January 21st, related to merit-based opportunities, that essentially eliminated or seeks to eliminate DEI in the private sector. And it does so by, one, revoking Executive Order 11246, which is the President Johnson executive order from 1965 that established affirmative action in federal contracting. and for federal contractors. And then in addition to that, basically gives guidance to federal contractors and into private employers who are not federal contractors as to what is expected and what sort of investigations may be conducted by the Department of Justice and other departments. For federal contractors, it even goes so far to require two clauses that will be put in their contracts, which I believe the federal government's already doing, but that basically indicates that they agree to follow federal anti-discrimination law under penalty of the False Claims Act potentially, and then to certify that they do not have any illegal DEI programs that violate federal anti-discrimination law. These clauses are also being applied to federal fund recipients or grant recipients. And I also am aware that those clauses are currently being applied to them too. So, and I've seen some of that with some of my clients. So that's probably the most prominent of the orders for federal contractors. But there's a lot of other ones too that they got to be aware of. One of them relates to gender identity and sexual orientation, particularly gender identity in the workplace. It's an executive order that expresses the federal government's, or really the White House's, position that there are two genders and that that gender is biological, and that this and seeking to restrict federal contractors, the federal government, and employers from practicing what the White House calls, in quotes, gender ideology. And but at the same time, doesn't really change the underlying law for employers, which is that they can't discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity in the workplace, but clearly indicates that that will not be as much of an enforcement priority for this administration, and that they're probably going to be looking at religious accommodation law too, and making sure that people who have religious objections to, recognizing someone's transgender status, that those individuals are still respected in the workplace and that they're not fired either. But, a lot of it is about showing respect to people who have different views and different identities, and making sure that they are able to work and not be discriminated against. So there's that executive order. And then there's a number of other executive orders that show that the federal government is very focused on anti-Semitism, particularly with universities. And I suspect that will apply to their workforces too, and is a response to some extent to the protests over the summer that you saw at a lot of Ivy League schools in particular, including my alma mater, Columbia. And also some of the congressional investigations, congressional hearings with the Ivy League presidents being scrutinized and held to account by Congress, and that back and forth that you saw. So the Trump administration has indicated that anti-Semitism is discrimination, and they're going to take away federal funds or potentially federal contracts down the line if you engage in that at all. And of course, I'll just say that's very consistent with enforcing anti-discrimination. Anti-Semitism is wrong. It's discrimination against Jewish people, and it's prohibited and it's wrong. And it's good to see an administration focused on that. And they also will hopefully be focused on eliminating Islamophobia, eliminating discrimination against all religions. And I will note that there is an executive order that specifically focuses on Christians and preventing discrimination against Christians, Catholics, which are a majority in the United States, Christians. But it's basically saying that any discrimination against any religious group, that's the way I read it, is illegal, and that this administration is going to be very pro-religion, which I think was expected. I definitely think was expected. They used to be pretty bipartisan too. Remember RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that came about, and there was a lot of support even during the Clinton administration for that. And I think it got almost unanimous support in Congress. That's become more controversial over time, but there's still a lot of support for prohibiting discrimination based on religion in this country. And there's also the First Amendment that protects the free exercise of religion. So I think that that's something that's going to probably get a lot of support from Democrats too, to be honest, and it's likely to be largely bipartisan. And then it's expected that there's going to be, what the next sort of thing that I think employers are looking for is what's going to when Secretary Designate Lori Chavez DeRemer is confirmed. Her confirmation hearings tomorrow. She's likely to be confirmed this week or next week. What will be labor policy, labor and employment policy? What are we going to see from the Department of Labor on independent contractor, fiduciary rule, overtime rule, other regulations? Um, Represented Congresswoman DeRemer, because she's a former Congresswoman. Right now, she's not secretary yet. So I'll say Congresswoman DeRemer was known when she was in Congress for probably being more moderate, um, particularly on labor issues, supporting the PRO Act, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And it's well known that President Trump got the support of the Teamsters to some extent in his in his campaign, and that the Teamsters president wanted Lori Chavez DeRemer to be the nominee and strongly supported that, and that President Trump did that. And President Trump's labor policy has been a little different than traditional Republican labor policy, particularly when it comes to tariffs. In fact, I don't think that there's been a president more favorable toward tariffs since President McKinley, which he likes to mention President McKinley. So he's very favorable toward tariffs, which traditionally have been favored by labor. So I think that labor policy is a little bit different than most Republican administrations. He's getting more support from labor, and he's gotten a lot of support from the white working class, which makes up the predominant part of unions. So even though unions tend to still be more favorable toward Democratic candidates, a lot of the union membership has been supporting President Trump. So I think that that's part of the reason you see Lori Chavez DeRemer be the likely secretary once she's confirmed. So I think there's a lot of interest in what will that mean. And then, of course, Keith Sonderling, who's a dear friend of mine and who I served with in the Trump administration. He was the acting administrator of the Wage and Hour Division when I was OFCCP director. And we've continued to be friends over the years. Very proud of him, and wonderful pick as deputy secretary, in my opinion. He has a lot of support from the business community. And so I think that team of the two of them will balance each other out, and I think that will be a very effective team. So we'll see.
You brought up a good point with the wage and hour. I've spent quite a bit of hours, with wage and hour remediations, especially here in Massachusetts. What's your take on sort of the path forward, or the path forward in terms of new wage and hour audits that or legislation that might come out that might change some of these remediations that we've had to do, quite particularly, around the rest and meal breaks?
So I think, you're going to see more guidance from the federal government on wage and hour. Keith Sonderling, the deputy secretary designate, he was famous for issuing lots of opinion letters when he was in wage and hour. He's co-authored a law review article, a strong proponent of opinion letters, giving guidance. So I think you will see a lot of guidance coming from the Department of Labor on wage and hour issues, including on meals and on rest breaks. I think that you'll tend to see a more conservative approach toward that, more pro-business, but there will be a significant pro-worker component too, which is what I think people are waiting to see how that will balance out. But anytime guidance is provided to business, it's appreciated by business, even if it ends up being a little bit more moderate or even liberal, because at least then they know, well, look, if I do this, I'm not going to be subject to an audit, and my competitors they're going to have to do it too. So I'm not going to have some free rider here who's just going to do whatever they want, and then we're the ones who get stuck with the enforcement action or stuck with the bill of having to have higher labor costs. So I think that providing guidance, you typically see that more in Republican administrations. Keith is the quintessential guidance person. Like that's central to who he is as a regulator. So and he's known for that. So you'll definitely see a lot more of that. In terms of, now you may see like more liberal states like Massachusetts, for example, push back on more conservatism from the federal government and try to impose their own view, maybe under the view that it's a higher standard and they're requiring higher labor standards. But, I don't think you're going to see that from wage and hour. I think you're going to see an idea that, better guidance is good and decreasing labor costs is good because it leads to more people being employed and it helps growth. So I do think you'll see a pro-growth approach from wage and hour. I'm not sure exactly how they'll come down on those issues though, just because I do know that with Secretary Chavez DeRemer, they are planning to have a more worker focus.
Now, you mentioned some of the steps that companies are going to be able to take or required to take, right, with compliance.
Oh, can I say one more thing about the audits?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because you asked me about audits too, not just opinions. I think you're going to see a lot of audits, but I think you're going to see them more focused on areas where blue collar type jobs, which really are responsive to protecting workers who can't always protect themselves and may not be able to hire an attorney as easily. So I think you're going to see a big focus on restaurants, particularly with the no tax on tips focus of the president. I think restaurants are going to be a huge focus, the service industry and manufacturing. I suspect you'll see a lot more wage and hour audits there, probably less so in the Biden administration and the Democratic administrations. You tend to see it more focused on executive level type positions, office type work. They still do the restaurants and places like that, but you do see it more. You tend to see more on the executive type white collar jobs, including with pay equity and OFCCP. When Executive Order 11246 was in effect, and the EOC tends to focus more on executive level jobs in Democratic administrations too. I definitely think it's going to be a big focus on blue collar jobs.
Got it. Okay.
And construction.
Yeah, the no tax on tips. I thought that was brilliant. Certainly, like you said, kind of goes hand in hand with the populist mentality. More moderate, leaning type perspectives. So what steps in your mind